So today we're going to talk about fastboot. Okay, good. We're good. Has anybody here used fastboot in like a production environment? Nice, I like it. Okay, so feel free to call me out if I like say anything wrong, because I have not. I have just done the reading and done a couple like side projects that are not full production. So anyway, for those of you who have not done it, I'm just going to go through like a quick start to get everything up and running, and then talk about some of the usefulness of what fastboot gives you. So basically, let's start off by talking about what fastboot is and what it is not. So fastboot basically allows you to render your Ember applications on the server side and in an initial state, and so it will be served up as like the fully rendered HTML page to the client. Whereas without fastboot, all you get is basically just the index.html file that gets loaded when you hit your URL to go get your Ember app, which basically just loads your CSS and your vendor and your app JavaScript, right? Everybody's kind of seen that file, very minimal. And so what fastboot does is it seeds everything in there, like it's loading up your entire Ember app and then gives it back out to the client. And so it has, performance increases for not having to go get the data after everything has been loaded on the client and everything, and also you get a lot of like server-side rendering, which I'll go into, performance increases. So let's talk about how to do it. So Tom Dale has done a really good job at working on this, and a lot of other contributors have been doing a lot of work, but he has, I think, done the brunt of the work on the Ember-CLI fastboot, which basically wraps everything up that you need for fastboot. So there's the actual fastboot library, which does all the hard work underneath the hood, which hooks up into the Glimmer rendering engine, which makes it so that you can actually render your HTML on Node.js instead of in the browser. And then the CLI fastboot actually allows you to serve your assets locally like you would be doing in a production environment with fastboot. So basically what you can do here is run this command. Instead of saying ember serve, you say ember fastboot and then also -- serve assets when you're running locally. And so basically what this does is exactly the same as ember serve, except for one thing. Instead of going to port 4200, you go to port 3000, which I can show you right now. So right now I just have a app running that I made. Oh, it's loading over here. Hold. Okay, we're coming. Okay. So you can see that this is the Ember serve normally, and I have a little input box, and you can say this goes out to the GitHub API and just like fetches some data in the background on the model hook. And so if you look at the source for this, oh geez, you'll see that this is your normal index.html file that you would get, right? So you have your asset vendor.js, and my project name is code.js, and so there's no fastboot optimization here yet. But if you go to I'm serving the fastboot one, and it serves.
was going to say, can you refresh it just to show that flash?
Oh yeah, it happens like pretty quickly because there's not much on there. I was gonna show like a performance thing, but yeah. So the performance increases. Right now, what it does is loads your JavaScript once it gets the index.html, and then after that, it makes your AJAX request to get this information from GitHub. So if you go to port 3000, which is rendering the fastboot server, you'll see that actually you can even see it change. But if you look at the source code, you'll see that we now are pre-populating your body with the actual template logic, and then we're also still loading your vendor and code.js. And so if you go back to here, one cool thing I did, which I'll just talk about in a little bit, but so let's say this is a dynamic, right? We have like a query parameter that's hooked up to your controller, and it's dynamically loading your model based off of what's coming in the query parameter. And so if you refresh this page, it'll go back to this, pre-filled in. If you look at the source code, or the source of the index.html, it'll already be pre-populated with the correct information. So, so that's how to get it up and running. And it's super easy to, I just destroyed everything over here. It's not good. Okay. So it's super easy to get your Ember app pre-existing into fastboot configuration. You basically just have, you install, you basically install this, and that's you're pretty much there. And then as far as deploying it, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but some of the things that you have to watch out for when you're actually doing development is when you're doing anything in components, some of the methods, some of the component lifecycle hooks are not called, which are the did insert element and the will insert element, and the rest of them are. But the reason why these are not called is because in practice you're not supposed to be actually, I mean, those two methods are where you're supposed to be using like third-party DOM manipulation and third-party like jQuery things when you're initializing them in your components. And the reason why these are not called is because jQuery is not loaded in Node.js, which is where fastboot is running. And so you cannot actually, so there's like all these like, so you have to be careful on which add-ons you're including in your application, because a lot of them might not follow this pattern, or they might be manipulating the DOM directly in other ways, which will then obviously break fastboot. So yes, avoid jQuery where you can, and make sure you're only putting them into those specific lifecycle hooks that only get called once you actually get out to the browser.
Is there other general fallback strategies you can deploy?
So yes, so they are, I mean, kind of. What you can do is there's a fastboot service, which I'm going to talk about in a second, which allows you to check to see if you're in the fastboot environment. So you can conditionally say, hey, I do want to load this jQuery thing, or I don't want to. And there's also other areas when you're developing add-ons and in your CLI boot process, there's environment variables that get set for Ember-CLI fastboot, I think is what the environment variable set is, I think, right? Something like that. Anyway. Yeah, so so another thing that fastboot does is it is promise aware on all the model hooks, just as your regular Ember app is. It'll respect the before model and after model hooks, and it'll wait for those promises to resolve before it actually sends out your HTML. So it waits for these to resolve, populates or hydrates your HTML, and then sends it out to the client. So there is a fastboot service that has a couple different properties on it, and this is what I was talking about. One of them is just a Boolean to check to see if you are in Node.js land before it's actually been served out to the client, and you can do stuff like conditionally fetching network requests on there, or conditionally doing jQuery stuff, DOM manipulation. And then it also has a couple different things. It also includes the response and the request that come from the client and that Node.js creates for the response. And so this whole thing is built kind of in a similar fashion that, I don't know if anybody's used or familiar with Express, the Node.js server-side framework. But it basically sits under like a middleware of Express. And so it has the same properties, these response and requests properties that a Node.js Express server would have in there. And so you get all those features on top of there. So like accessing like your query parameters and other things when you're in Node.js. And then SHOEBOX, which I'll talk about in a second, is another pretty important thing. And the last thing here, you can have a deferred rendering method that basically you give it a promise and it'll wait. So if you don't want to have something in those model hooks, you can return a promise in this deferred rendering method, and then it'll wait for any sort of like asynchronous actions to happen before it actually sends out your HTML. So here's just an example real quick of injecting the fastboot and checking to see if we're in the fastboot environment. In this case, we're conditionally going and checking to see, let's say we have like a weather widget on the page that we don't really care to have it be loaded on the client right away. We want that to be asynchronous, but in fastboot we want to load it, so we say load it here, and it'll wait for the promise to resolve. So this other concept of fastboot is this thing called a SHOEBOX, which basically what happens is when you make a network request in fastboot, you can basically say, I want to set, it gives you a property on the fastboot service that says you can set properties in your HTML so that when the client gets it, it's already pre-populated with the data. You don't have to go make another AJAX request. So, so in here you can see that in your model hook, we're checking to see if we're in fastboot. If we are, we want to actually make that network request and then say, okay, now put this data in this like SHOEBOX, right, which basically just injects it into the script tag in your index.html. And then once you're on the client, you say here at the bottom, you just pull that out of the SHOEBOX store, which is just grabbing from the index.html, and so it should be like super fast. Yeah.
One thing to remember about that is currently that only works for straight requests, not queries. So find record, etc. But if you do a query, those are never captured. So just be aware you'll be fetching data twice.
Okay, interesting. Did not know that. Okay. So yeah, so that's SHOEBOX, very powerful. Highly recommended to use. So yeah, so here are some of the properties that you can get on the request. One caveat is if you are using Ember Simple Auth, the default behavior there is to put your session cookie or your session in local storage. So once you get authenticated, it puts it into local storage for you, and that's the default. You can, however, set it to a cookie. storage, and which is what you would have to do if you want to have pass through your authentication back to the server to have it make sure you're actually logging in as who you say you are. And so during the request, you only get cookies, and so for the server to actually render your stuff and say that you're authenticated, you have to pass in your authentication through cookies. And so it has a couple other things. It has the query parameters, which is pretty useful, which is what I was using before, which I'll show you in a code example. Sure. Oh, man. Hold, please. That's not going to go well. Why is it not going over there? Okay. Well, this is failing. Okay, never mind. Anyway, so query parameters can get passed back, and then you can use those in your model hook like you regularly would with query parameters in Ember, and you can go and conditionally fetch records with those query parameters. And then the response just has two things on it. It has the headers and the status code. So if you want to do any like conditional checking to make sure that you are, getting the right response code that you want, that is available. And then a couple add-ons that are pretty useful right now that are getting used. This is just a couple that I found. There's a lot of other ones that are already being developed, and there's a lot of compatible fastboot add-ons out there already as well. But these specifically, the Ember network actually is also made by Tom Dale, and it's basically a polyfill, and it checks to see if you are in a fastboot environment or in the browser, and it polyfills based off of the fetch API in Node versus the fetch API in the browser. And so in your code, you basically just say include Ember network and fetch whatever AJAX request you want. And then it should work in fastboot and in the browser. And then the document title is very useful for basically dynamically setting your title in your index.html before it gets sent out to the browser. So for stuff like SEO, where you want to have extra, or like your title included into your index when Google crawls it, then it's very useful. And then same with the Ember-CLI head, which basically allows you to inject things into the meta tags into the head of your index.html, which can be used for stuff like AMP, or like the asynchronous, the mobile, what's it called? Yeah, accelerated mobile pages. So another thing that fastboot allows you to do, right, is having the ability to have Google crawl your websites. And so it helps you with SEO, where Ember was falling short with that before, right? And so there was other pages out there, or other websites out there, like prerender.io and a couple other ones that would go and try to actually load up all your JavaScript using Phantom.js or something like that. And so then Google could go crawl those. But those cost a lot of money and they're not that fast. And so this basically helps you solve that problem where it actually will render all your JavaScript on the server side before, and so that Google can come crawl your pages. And again, another thing that this does, so one of the new things that a lot of people are doing with their websites right now is turning them into these AMP websites, which I'm sure maybe you've seen on Google. They have a little grayed out icon that says AMP, or on Facebook, or a lot of different places. Allows you to quickly, they cache things on their side to be able to quickly render and have more of an offline experience. And so so using that Ember-CLI meta tag, you can make your Ember app into an AMP application that will be quickly rendered in most of these sites, which I thought was pretty cool. So the last thing, which has been a big focus in the development of Fastboot, is being able to have it be somewhat of like a drop-in solution where you can actually just like go out there and deploy it right away without having too much overhead. So what they did is they built it into Ember-CLI deploy, which I don't know. Do you have a raise of hands? How many people are using Ember-CLI deploy? Okay. Highly recommend using Ember-CLI deploy. It is very extensible, and so you can basically configure it to almost anything, any deployment configuration that you already have. I've used it in a couple different environments, and it allows you to do a lot of really great things. But what they did is made a couple different plugins to Ember-CLI deploy. One for Heroku, one for Elastic BEANSTALK, which is AWS's competitor to Heroku, basically. And then they have a custom like Node.js Express middleware. So you can, if you are already running a Node.js server, you can just like plug it in as a middleware, and it should serve your assets in like a Fastboot format. So when I was doing this, I tried out the Elastic BEANSTALK one, which is their like recommended one, and it worked very well. It was super easy. So basically, in their README, they basically tell you to configure your AWS, and then you provision. You say Ember EB provision, Elastic BEANSTALK provision, which then goes out and creates all this stuff that you would normally have to do by creating like S3 buckets and Elastic BEANSTALK and doing all this like stuff that you would usually have to do. It does that all for you, and then all you have to do is set a couple environment variables in your deploy.js, which is part of Ember-CLI deploy. You set the buckets where these assets are being sent to, and then you just say deploy development or deploy staging. And so I got this up and running in like 15 minutes or less from creating a new AWS account all the way from scratch. So it was pretty sweet. And now you have a full Fastboot rendered website that can be crawled by Google. So yeah, I think that's about it. I was going to do some more like demoing, but currently having technical issues. So, does anybody have any other questions? Yeah.
Can you go back to the Fastboot surface slide?
Yes.
Yeah, this one. Okay, so there's, I've been helping out with the Fastboot team recently, and there's a brand new one called metadata.
Okay.
And it lets you, if you're in Express land, it lets you throw stuff into Fastboot service and read it back out once you get into Ember, but only in Node. So you've got like two layers of passing stuff around. You've got you're in Express, and then you start rendering your Ember, and you have a way to pass stuff to it. Like in Express, I know stuff about cookies, or I know stuff about something else Express related. Jam it into fastbootservice.metadata, and then once you're in Ember and like an initializer or something, you read it out as metadata, but only when you're in Fastboot. When you're down at the client, metadata is gone. It wipes it out. It doesn't serialize it down. So if you want to get something from Express all the way down to the client, you put it in metadata. When you're in Node in Ember Fastboot, read it out of metadata, then jam it in the SHOEBOX, and then it's serialized down to you at the client.
Okay.
It's very verbose, but that's how you do it if you want to do it. I worked through it when it was implemented.
Nice. Yeah, I can see how that could have its use cases. Yeah. Hi.
Since Fastboot is server side,
Yep.
DOM manipulation. Since you're not using jQuery, what's the best practice you use?
You can still do dominant manipulation, but you do it in those hooks. You do it in a bit insert element, and you make sure that your so to make sure it doesn't break, you basically stuff any dominant manipulation into those hooks. And so it's okay to do dominant manipulation as long as it's in those hooks. So if you hit a route and it's not doing any dominant manipulation until those hooks fire, you're fine because fastboot doesn't fire those hooks. So that's you isolate it